Welcome to the Houdini HOULY Challenge Series. So, SideFX is holding a 31-day challenge where artists create a piece per day based on a daily topic. I've decided to take on the challenge and record each day's work so that you can see the process. I'm doing this so that I can challenge myself, and I'd recommend that you do the same. So, let's get straight into it. Right, so today was slime. When I say today, I actually mean yesterday. I'm recording this the same time that I'm recording the fur one, just because all of my renders have kind of started to overlap and, you know, it's been a bit messy. So yeah, this one is slime. Originally, I wanted to do a mud skipper. You know, he was just gonna kind of blink. It was gonna be a very simple, subtle animation. I thought that would be kind of cute and funny, but then I decided, you know, that's not really showing off slime, that's kind of showing off modeling, and I don't want to show off modeling because I'm not very good at modeling. Decided to go for a slug. Slug, super easy to model, but I could focus on the slime. The idea was, originally, from Stranger Things, when Will throws up the slug into the basin, he kind of just bleh, and then this black slug falls out of his mouth and like crawls down the drain. I wanted to have it like that. And then I took the idea a step further and thought, what happens if it starts like that and then becomes like a disco slug? So the scene lights up and it's almost like neon paint that the slug is swimming in, and there's glitter in that. And then I dialed it back a bit because I was like, that sounds ridiculous. So the final idea was kind of a glittery, glimmering slime on the slug that falls. So this is what I came up with. Okay, so after the fact, I can show you what I did. So you saw in the time lapse, it's just this tube. I flatten it by using this attribute wrangle so that all the points line up with 0. Subdivide, and edit him, stretch him out. Once again, flatten it to 0, make some edits, kind of. So this is the thing, I didn't know how I was going to use the slug. I didn't know if I wanted a close-up at some point, and I didn't know how much detail was going to be seen, so I gave him this sort of edge over here. Slugs are weird creatures, man. They're kind of like little tanks. They have these sort of track tires. I don't know how to explain it. Anyways, clip, mirror, VDB, convert. Then that's not very nice geometry. So this was the boring part. Retopo, subdivide, array it back onto the surface, clip. And then you can see I grouped that edge because I thought I was going to use it, but I didn't. And then I mirror it, just give him normals and transform him down. Now, if you check in the time lapse, I actually forgot originally to transform him down. And so I had this 5 meter slug, and I'm wondering why all of my simulations are looking so weird. Like, he's falling, but he's falling in what seems like slow motion. Because obviously it's relative. If a 5 meter long object is falling 10 meters, it's only falling twice its length, right? But if a slug of 10 centimeters is falling 10 meters, then, you know, it's 100 times the distance. So that made a big difference in the way the simulations look. But that also gave me a bit of an issue in my FEM setup. So I'll get to that soon. So fuse him, then use a solid embed. Now what solid embed is for creating FEM. FEM is finite elements. Basically, it's somewhere between rigid body and vellum. It's actually a very old solve, and it existed before vellum. Because I remember working with FEM and not really enjoying it. It's a bit of it's an awkward one to work with. I don't enjoy working with FEM. It gets the job done though. That's for sure. I mean, I even used it in what form? Red Sea Diving Resort. There was a shot where this plane flies into this tree, and the tree's branches have to break and leaves have to go flying everywhere. So for that, you know, a tree branch has some bend in it, and then at a point it snaps. And FEM is pretty good for that. So I did that in FEM. I wasn't very good back then. I think it would have probably just been easier to keyframe that sort of thing, like create a fracture and then keyframe it for when the plane impacts, because it was only like one branch that needed to really bend and break. And I was getting really unpredictable results from it. But yeah, that's another tip. If you can avoid dynamics because you know what the camera move is going to look like or whatever it may be, just fake it. Like, if you can get it looking good with just a couple of transform nodes, you could maybe work 2 hours and get it working with transforms rather than working for, 17 hours because you have to simulate FEM every time. But yeah, just try to fake things as much as you can, unless you're trying to learn. But when you're actually working like on industry shots and things, faking a shot is always good. Almost always good. So I transform the slug up. That gives me the one that falls. And then I also do this thing with the bend, right? So you can see over here, he dances. He has a little bit of a jiggle. So he's got a bit of a jig going. It's just kind of keyframed with like sine functions and that. So he does that. I use that for motion, but I'll get back to that. So FEM motion and the slug, that gets fed into a FEM setup. Okay, let me show you FEM. FEM is one that a lot of people pretty much never even use in Houdini, but it's interesting, you can do cool things with it. I chose organic mass as an initialization behavior, but then I adjusted it. So I doubled its mass density, decreased the stiffness multiplier from 1000 to 100. Damping ratio, I decreased. The damping ratio is how quickly it returns to its original shape or something, or how quickly it like loses movement. And then you have shape stiffness over here and volume stiffness. So how well it keeps its shape and how well it keeps its volume. There's nothing much going on here. I just increase his friction at the bottom. This is something I didn't know existed. I didn't know you could scroll down because this looks like the end. So I scrolled down and I was like, what? Friction? Cool. Because that's kind of what was missing. You're sliding around a bit much. Here is where I bring in that little motion slug, the one that's busy doing his dance, Insert dance music here. Okay, so then I use a trail node to generate velocity. So I rename it to motion because I don't want to overwrite the dynamic network velocity. And that's what would happen if I didn't rename it. So I name it fiat motion equals velocity. So this thing's velocity. And then I give it some movement forward. So the X velocity is a little bit higher than all the other velocity. That just makes sure that my slug moves forward more than it moves back. Also, you'll do a little like back and forth thing. So you transfer that motion value over. You say v at v plus equals v at motion times a multiplier of motion. So each time it's using a bit of this movement, right? So once you simulate that out, you end up with the slug that falls. I'll show you from the camera perspective. Splat. Alright, I'll show you in slow motion as well, because Fen is kind of interesting. So you see, he hits and he deforms, and then that motion stuff starts to do some work. And he basically just looks like a burrito. What you can do with this, like I did in the dog balloon one, I mentioned that Houdini is very good for deforming high res geometry with low res geometry. So I do that again, this time using a point deform. So my slug, oh, I'll also just give him some eyes. I was like, you know, it would be better if he had some eyes. So slug now gets eyes. It's just this VDB converted, and then I blast 2 points and then use their normals to place these. So you merge those, point deform, then you have the high res slug that falls. Trail node him for velocity, then you can output him. Okay, so you have missed the slug. So you take that into the slime simulation. So this is what I'm sure you're all interested in. I time shift him to the first frame, lock him in place, because you don't want this on the left to happen every frame, you just want it to happen once. I make a VDB of him, convert the VDB, ISO offset scatter, group the points inside, then blast those inside points. So it just gives you basically a casing of points. I realized I overcomplicated it. I could have probably just used the scatter on the original geometry on a point jitter, it would have done the same thing. But for some reason I like to make my life difficult, you know? Then you take that and you point deform it so that it doesn't have to recache every time. This is what I was talking about. If you had to, say, just take this, remove that time shift and plug this straight in, it would have to create a VDB every frame. But when it does this, it only creates that VDB once. But what it does every frame is it deforms points from that VDB. So it's super quick, right? So these points are going to be the source for the slime. What I do is I give an attribute noise for viscosity. You can see over here that there's varying viscosity and it changes every frame. It ranges from 1 to 20. I found that that was a good range. I also make a color range thing. I didn't end up using it for color, but I did end up using it to drive my density. So I just say density equals color range times 1000. So it's anywhere between 50 and 1000. Then I transfer on velocity from the original slug. So now these points have the same velocity when they're falling and moving. So that is an output, rather an input for my flip simulation. So the flip simulation is over here. So this is a very useful tip. If you're going to take away a tip from the series, maybe make it this one. So flip is a bit of an interesting solver in that it's kind of a hybrid. It's a hybrid between pyro and pop. So as you know, pop solvers work by bringing in some particles. They have attributes on them such as velocity, age, all of those things, and that drives the simulation. Pyro works a bit differently in that it has volumes. It has things like heat and temperature, fuel, density, all of those things, right? And color. Those are all advected as volume. Advection is just the movement of values through motion. So when you say volume advection, it's movement of values through a volume. So pyro uses volume advection, but so does flip. But flip also uses particles, so it's a bit of a hybrid. But as you know, with flip, you don't actually source in the volume. With pyro you do, you have to source in things like density and temperature. But with flip you don't, they get auto-generated, which means you only need to focus on what? The particles, which means that you don't have to use any sort of like flip source or volume source, anything like that. You don't have to do anything complicated. You can use the pop source. That's great because pop source is really intuitive and easy to use. You can control exactly how many particles are coming in. You can control attributes that are being brought in. You can control, you know, a whole range of things. And most people are very comfortable with pops as well, which is nice.
Nice.
Because you don't have to learn how to do a whole new type of dynamic solving just because you want to do flip. You can use a pop source. Then you only have to learn basically the flip solver. So I use a pop source. I bring in those points. These are keyframed, so there's a lot of points initially, and then later on it's basically just creating points to maintain that sliminess. 2 colliders, ground plane, and the actual slug. That goes into this flip solver. Flip solver is where most of the effect comes from. Firstly, I add an ID attribute that's useful later. Basically, there's a distinction to make. When you're working with dynamics, your point numbers change all the time. The flip solver, for example, kills points, adds points. So point 1 this frame might be point 38 next frame. And that's not very useful if you're trying to make sure that things are sticking to particular points. So you use ID, because if a point is point number 1 now and point 38 next frame, that's a problem. But if its ID is ID number 3 now, it'll be ID number 3 next frame. So you can use ID. I suggest almost always adding ID as an attribute. It's very useful. You never know what you might want to do after the simulation. You can also do things like bubbles with ID, which is fun. Anyways, reseeding. This is important because of surface oversampling. Surface oversampling it's basically the goal. Like, if you have some points, how many points should there be? It's how Flip kind of maintains volume. So it defines how voluminous is that a word? Voluminous? Volume, how much volume there is, right? It tries to maintain volume. So this is very nice for high viscosity simulations. So keep that in mind. I also remove all droplets. Because this is a high velocity simulation to begin with, there's lots of little points that shoot off and you need to kill them off. So you detect droplets and you kill them on detection. That avoids things like a single point oversampling and creating a long stream of particles. The only other thing is some surface tension, so that it kind of holds together. It gives it a nice slimy kind of look. Viscosity. Viscosity is driven by that attribute, and so is density. So those are both driven by attributes being brought in, and you end up with this splat. If you take a look, it comes falling down, splat, right? The cool thing is, I'll show you this color over here. You can see viscosity, so it's between 1 and 20. It's defined by this over here, the attribute noise. And so you can see that different points have different viscosity. Different points also have different density. So density, this one's between 50 and 1000. That's pretty cool. But why is that useful? Why would I need something like this? Firstly, it changes the way that your simulation looks. It gives you some areas of like thinner fluid and thicker fluid, makes it look more interesting and more realistic in terms of sliminess. But also, if I set this to say infrared, you can see something interesting here. If you're coming from Instagram and you've already seen what the final product looks like, this is what's driving that interesting reflection, right? It's density or viscosity. I think I use viscosity, but I might be mistaken. And I set it to an infrared map. And then I apply that infrared map to the reflection color. Convert this to a fluid and Boolean in my actual snail so that his eyes are always covered. Attribute transfer over all attributes. So I'm transferring over these over here. Photicity, V, rest 2, CD, color range, viscosity, density, outputting that. So now I have geometry. Geometry is splat. You can see those attributes still apply, right? They're still on here. Only thing I haven't shown you is the glitter. Glitter's cool. Glitter's cool. It's surprisingly easy. So this is where it all comes in handy to have that ID attribute. What I do over here is I say if rand at ID greater than 0.1 or viscosity is greater than 6, remove points. So that culls a whole bunch of points. Then I also give them a p-scale and I give them a random up value and a random n value and add my velocity to it. V at up plus V at n when copying to points gives you orientations. So as you can see, I have random orientations now. And any particles that are moving have velocity added to them, right? And this is actually my favorite part of the effect. It looks great. Like, I love the glitter look. I like the way it moves in the fluid because it is the fluid itself. I'm just putting some of those points as glitter. So glitter, ground, slug, and the simulation. In the material network, the slime. This is what you might be interested in. I take, density. Okay, yeah, it's density, it's not viscosity. So I take density, I map it. It goes, should be from 50 to 1000, but I use 200. You can see I put that into a ramp. Then I color mix it so I can adjust it and put that into the reflectivity. I use color plus edge tint. This is the same thing that metallics use when you're working in Redshift. The Fresnel type of color plus edge tint. So I had that and I was like, what would happen if I do that plus make this look like water? And the effect was quite interesting. You end up with what almost looks like an oil slick where you have interesting colors on top, but it still looks like water. This one at the bottom basically doesn't do anything. It did initially, but it's the refraction weight. So if my refraction weight is lower, then there's areas of diffuse in the liquid. And that's also kind of interesting. You can have areas that are very transparent and areas that aren't. So the render looks like this. As you can see, like I was saying, it's kind kind of like a bubble, kind of like an oil slick. It's got that look to it. And it makes the slug look really interesting because this is a very basic slug. It's just like a black slug with a bump map. And then you can see the little bits of glitter in the liquid. Makes it look really interesting. I can also show you, let me show you what the slug looks like without anything. Just so that you know that this is actually a really boring slug. The simulation is what makes him interesting, right? He just looks like a turd. He's a burrito turd. So yeah, that's how he looks when, you know, there's no simulation over it. You put the simulation over. So yeah, then it was just about lighting. There was hardly any compositing really. Oh, actually, I lie. There was a bit of an interesting thing that I did in compositing. So when you zoom out and you happen to have a repeating pattern, like my background, you'll notice lines. I think it's, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's like screen tearing. I might be mistaken. It might be something else. But you can see that these lines basically line up. And some of them get anti-aliased out, and you end up being able to see lines running across. So what I do is I use a deform with a noise pattern to slightly deform the whole image. That means that things don't line up anymore. So it can't form straight lines across. So it doesn't look weird anymore. But if you have screen tearing, add a slight deform to your image, it seems to fix it. The final render looks like this. And it's also the style that I enjoy, which is this weird realism, where it's kind of real, but where would you ever see something like this, right? So it looks kind of realistic, but it looks completely weird as well. So expect more glittery slugs. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.